If we are to speak of water merely as a chemical substance, two hydrogen atoms bound to one oxygen atom, then we begin already with a misunderstanding so subtle that it often escapes notice. For what we call water, in our everyday language, is not simply a molecule, nor even a collection of molecules, but a phenomenon, a dynamic expression of order that appears at the intersection of physics, chemistry, biology, and, if we dare to go further, the structure of experience itself. You may have been told that water breaks the rules of physics, but this is not quite accurate. The rules are not broken. Rather, they reveal their incompleteness. And it is precisely in such moments when a familiar substance refuses to behave, as our simplified models predict, that we are invited to glimpse something deeper, not merely the complexity of matter, but the limitations of our ways of knowing it. Consider what we mean by a rule of physics. In its strictest sense, it is not a command imposed upon nature, but a description of patterns we have observed and found reliable. Yet these descriptions always depend upon a certain abstraction. They are born from isolating parts of reality, simplifying them, treating them as if they were independent objects interacting in a mechanical world. This method has yielded extraordinary success. It allows us to predict the motion of planets, the behavior of gases, the flow of electric currents. But its success rests upon a hidden assumption that the world is fundamentally composed of separate things whose interactions can be understood independently of the whole. Water challenges this assumption in a way that is almost poetic. Take the simplest example. Most substances become denser as they cool, contracting as their internal motion decreases. But water, when it approaches freezing, does something peculiar. It expands. Ice floats upon liquid water. If this were not so, the lakes and oceans of the earth would freeze from the bottom upward, and the biological history of our planet would have unfolded very differently, perhaps not at all. Why does water behave this way? The answer, from the standpoint of physics, lies in the cooperative interactions among its molecules. Each molecule of water forms a network of hydrogen bonds, delicate connections that constantly form and dissolve. As the temperature drops, these bonds arrange themselves into a more open, ordered structure, creating space rather than eliminating it. The colder the water becomes, the more this network asserts itself, until, at freezing, it locks into a crystalline lattice that occupies more volume than the disordered liquid state. This is often explained in textbooks as a curiosity of molecular geometry. But if we pause for a moment, we see something more profound. Water is not behaving as an independent collection of particles. It is behaving as a whole, as a cooperative system whose properties cannot be deduced by considering any molecule in isolation. Here we encounter the first hint of a deeper principle that the fundamental reality may not be the individual part, but the relational pattern. This idea, though now familiar in modern science, once stood in stark contrast to the classical worldview. In the mechanical picture of the 19th century, matter was composed of tiny, self-contained units moving through empty space. But the discoveries of the 20th century in quantum physics, in thermodynamics, in the emerging science of life, began to dissolve this picture. They revealed that what we call things are better understood as nodes within networks of relationships. Water, in its humble way, embodies this truth. Its remarkable capacity to dissolve substances arises from its polarity, the uneven distribution of electrical charge within each molecule. Yet this polarity is not a static property. It is meaningful only within a context of interaction. Water molecules orient themselves collectively around ions, forming structured shells that stabilize chemical reactions. Without this dynamic dance. The chemistry of life would be impossible. Thus, water is not merely a passive medium in which life occurs. It is an active participant in the very processes that sustain living systems. And here we approach a question that lies beyond physics alone. Why should a substance exist whose properties are so exquisitely suited to the emergence of life? One might answer that this is simply a coincidence, an outcome of the laws of chemistry, but such an answer, while technically correct, fails to address the deeper philosophical implication, for it presupposes that the laws themselves are fundamental, self-explanatory realities. It treats them as if they existed independently of the world they describe. Yet if we reflect carefully, we see that laws of physics are abstractions. They are constructs of thought, distilled from patterns of observation. They exist not in nature as physical objects, but within our conceptual framework. And this leads us to a paradox that has long fascinated me. The scientific worldview presents itself as an objective description of a world that exists independently of the observer. But the very formulation of this worldview depends upon the existence of observers, conscious beings capable of perceiving patterns, constructing theories, and recognizing coherence. Without consciousness, there would be no laws of nature, only events. This realization compels us to reconsider the relationship between mind and matter. The prevailing assumption in modern science is that consciousness arises from complex arrangements of matter, that it is, in some sense, a byproduct of neural processes. But this assumption is not itself a scientific conclusion. It is a philosophical stance, inherited from the mechanistic tradition. In my own reflections, I have come to see that this stance may be inverted. Rather than treating consciousness as an accidental emergence from matter, we may consider it as the condition under which the concept of matter becomes meaningful at all. After all, what do we mean by matter except that which appears within experience? We never encounter matter directly in some absolute sense. We encounter sensations, perceptions, and interpretations. We construct models, highly effective models, that allow us to predict and manipulate phenomena. But these models exist within the realm of thought, and thought itself is inseparable from consciousness. Thus, the idea that matter exists independently of consciousness is not something we can verify empirically. It is an assumption, a useful one, perhaps, but not a necessary one. Water provides a subtle illustration of this philosophical tension. In classical physics, one might attempt to describe water entirely in terms of molecular interactions. But when we examine it closely at the level of quantum mechanics, we find that its behavior cannot be fully specified without reference to probability, uncertainty, and the role of observation. At the quantum level, the properties of a system are not fixed until they are measured. The act of observation is not a passive recording of an independent reality, but an active participation in the unfolding of that reality. This insight, though often misunderstood, has profound implications. It suggests that the separation between observer and observed is not absolute. The world does not exist as a collection of definite objects awaiting discovery. Rather, it emerges through a process of interaction that includes the observer as an integral part. When we say that water breaks the rules, what we truly mean is that it reveals the inadequacy of viewing the world as composed of isolated entities. It reminds us that reality is relational, dynamic, and deeply interconnected. This interconnectedness becomes even more evident when we consider the role of water in biological systems. Life, as I argued in my work times, what is life asterisk, cannot be fully understood through the lens of classical physics alone. Living organisms maintain a remarkable degree of order, despite the universal tendency toward disorder described by the second law of thermodynamics. They achieve this by importing energy and exporting entropy, by feeding, in a sense, upon negative entropy. But this process depends critically upon water. It is within the aqueous environment of the cell that the complex choreography of life unfolds, proteins folding into precise shapes, enzymes catalyzing reactions, genetic information being stored and transmitted. Water is not merely the stage upon which this drama occurs. It is part of the drama itself. Its molecular flexibility allows it to mediate interactions, to buffer fluctuations, to sustain the delicate balance upon which life depends. Thus we see that water occupies a unique position at the boundary between physics and biology. It is a physical substance, governed by chemical laws, yet its properties enable phenomena that transcend purely mechanical explanation. This brings us to a deeper question, one that lies at the heart of both science and philosophy. Is life merely an extraordinarily complex arrangement of matter, or does it represent a fundamentally different mode of organization? If we adopt the strictly mechanistic view, we are compelled to treat life as an emergent property, a byproduct of physical processes that, in principle, could be fully explained by them. But if we examine the nature of biological organization, its capacity for self-maintenance, adaptation, and purposeful behavior, we begin to sense that something more is at play. Not a mysterious vital force in the old sense, but a level of order that cannot be reduced to the properties of individual components. This is where the concept of information becomes essential. Living systems are not defined merely by their material composition, but by the patterns of information they embody. The same molecules that exist in non-living matter are arranged in living organisms in extraordinarily precise configurations. And it was precisely this recognition that life depends upon the storage and transmission of information that influenced the development of molecular biology. The search for the physical basis of genetic information ultimately led to the discovery of the structure of DNA, a milestone that owes, in part, to the conceptual framework introduced in Time's What is Life asterisk. Yet even here, we must tread carefully. Information is not a physical substance. It is a relational concept, meaningful only in the context of interpretation. A sequence of molecules becomes information only when it participates in a system capable of reading and responding to it. Thus, the study of life inevitably leads us back to the question of meaning, and meaning, in turn, leads us back to consciousness. We begin, perhaps, with water as a physical curiosity, a substance that behaves in unusual ways. But as we follow its implications, we find ourselves drawn into a much larger inquiry. We discover that the boundaries between physics, biology, and philosophy are not as rigid as they once appeared. We begin to see that the world is not a collection of separate domains, but a continuous tapestry of relationships, a unity that expresses itself through diverse forms. And within this unity, consciousness is not an isolated phenomenon confined to the human brain. It is the very condition under which the tapestry becomes visible at all. To say this is not to deny the importance of physical processes. It is to recognize that our understanding of them is always mediated by the structures of experience. The observer is not outside the system. The observer is part of the system. Thus, when we contemplate water, its fluidity, its capacity to sustain life, its defiance of simplistic rules, we are, in a subtle way, contemplating ourselves. For we, too, are dynamic patterns within a larger whole. We, too, participate in the continuous interplay of order and uncertainty, structure and possibility, And this realization brings us to a quiet but profound shift in perspective. We enter the study of nature seeking to understand an external world. But if we follow the inquiry to its deepest level, we discover that the world we seek to understand is not wholly external at all. It is the manifestation of a unity in which the knower and the known are inseparable. And it is here at this threshold between science and self-knowledge that the question of water, so humble in its origin, becomes something far more profound. For in its strange behavior, its subtle order, and its intimate connection to life, water seems to whisper a truth that our scientific language can only partially express, that the universe is not merely a machine composed of parts, but a living coherence in which everything participates, including the very consciousness that seeks to understand it. And if this is so, then the ultimate question is no longer merely how water behaves, nor even how life arises from matter, but something deeper still, a question that touches the very nature of existence. What if the universe, through the medium of life and consciousness, is not simply being observed, but is designed, in some mysterious way, coming to know itself? If we follow this line of reflection further, we begin to notice that what appears to us as a peculiarity of water is, in truth, a doorway into a deeper difficulty that has long haunted scientific thought, the difficulty of separating what is from how it is experienced. You may think of a glass of water placed upon a table. It seems to you a simple, stable object, occupying a definite space, possessing clear properties, weight, temperature, transparency. Yet everything about this perception depends upon a vast network of conditions, the functioning of your sensory organs, the interpretive activity of your nervous system, the conceptual structures through which you organize experience. At no point do you encounter water itself in some absolute sense. You encounter only appearances, filtered through the structure of consciousness. This fact is so ordinary that we often overlook its significance, but it has profound consequences for our understanding of reality. For if every observation is mediated by consciousness, then the idea of a world entirely independent of consciousness becomes, strictly speaking, untestable. It becomes an abstraction useful, perhaps, but not directly accessible. In classical science, this difficulty was largely ignored. The observer was treated as an external spectator, passively recording events unfolding in a self-contained universe. But the rise of quantum theory forced a reconsideration. At the quantum level, the act of observation cannot be neatly separated from the phenomenon observed. Measurement does not merely reveal a pre-existing state, it plays a role in defining that state. The famous example of Schrödinger's cat was never intended as a literal proposal, but as an illustration of this paradox. A system described by quantum mechanics can exist in a superposition of possibilities until an observation collapses it into a definite outcome. This is not a mystical claim, but a rigorous consequence of the mathematical structure of the theory. Yet its philosophical implications are startling. It suggests that the world, at its most fundamental level, is not composed of definite things, but of potentialities, a realm of possibilities that become actualized through interaction. Water, though a macroscopic substance, still bears traces of this quantum character. The hydrogen bonds that hold its molecules together are not static connections. They are probabilistic relationships, constantly fluctuating, forming and dissolving in patterns that cannot be predicted with absolute certainty. Thus, the apparent stability of water, the calm surface of a lake, the steady flow of a river is, in truth, the result of an underlying sea of dynamic possibilities. It is an emergent order arising from countless interactions, none of which can be fully understood in isolation. And here we encounter once more the theme of unity. The mechanistic worldview encourages us to think in terms of parts, atoms, molecules, cells, each possessing intrinsic properties that determine its behavior. But the deeper we investigate, the more we find that the behavior of any part depends upon its relations to the whole. A molecule of water does not possess its remarkable properties in isolation. It is only within the context of many interacting molecules that its characteristic behavior emerges. Remove it from this context, and its identity changes. In this sense, the distinction between part and whole becomes less clear. Each part is defined by its participation in a larger pattern. This insight has profound implications not only for physics and chemistry, but for our understanding of life itself. Living organisms are often described as complex machines, assemblies of parts, working together according to physical laws. But this analogy, while useful in certain respects, ultimately fails to capture the essence of living systems. A machine is constructed from the outside. Its parts retain their identity independently of the whole. They can be removed, replaced, rearranged. But a living organism is not assembled in this way. Its parts arise through processes internal to the organism itself. They are continuously renewed, transformed, integrated into a dynamic unity. And at the heart of this unity lies water. Within the living cell, water forms a structured environment that supports the intricate interactions of biological molecules. It enables proteins to fold into functional shapes, facilitates the transport of nutrients and signals, stabilizes the delicate balance of chemical reactions. But more than this, water participates in the regulation of life's processes. Its ability to form transient networks allows it to respond sensitively to changes in the cellular environment. It acts as a mediator, a communicator, a dynamic partner in the dance of life. Thus we see that water is not merely a passive background against which life unfolds. It is an integral component of life's organization, a bridge between the physical and the biological. This realization leads us to reconsider the nature of order in living systems. In classical thermodynamics, order is associated with low entropy, with highly structured arrangements that tend naturally to decay into disorder. But living organisms maintain and even increase their internal order over time. They do so by exchanging energy and matter with their environment, creating local pockets of organization within the broader flow of entropy. This process cannot be fully understood in purely mechanical terms. It involves the continual processing of information, the ability to detect patterns, respond adaptively, and sustain coherent structures over time. And here we encounter again the concept that has become central to modern science information. Information, unlike matter or energy, does not exist as a physical substance. It is a pattern, a relationship between elements that acquires meaning within a system capable of interpreting it. The genetic code, for example, is not merely a sequence of molecules. It is a symbolic system, conveying instructions that guide the development and functioning of living organisms. Its significance lies not in the molecules themselves, but in the relational patterns they embody. Thus, the study of life inevitably leads us beyond the domain of physics alone. It brings us into the realm of meaning, a realm that cannot be fully captured by equations or measurements. And this, in turn, brings us back to the question of consciousness. For meaning exists only in relation to awareness. A pattern becomes meaningful only when it is recognized as such. Without consciousness, there would be no distinction between information and noise. no interpretation, no understanding. This is why I have long argued that consciousness cannot be regarded merely as an incidental byproduct of physical processes. It is, rather, the fundamental condition under which the concepts of information, order, and reality itself become possible. This does not imply that consciousness exists independently of the physical world. On the contrary, it suggests that the distinction between consciousness and the physical world may be less absolute than we have imagined. In my philosophical reflections, I have proposed that the multiplicity of conscious beings may be an appearance, a manifestation of a deeper unity. Each individual consciousness may be understood as a particular perspective within a single, underlying reality. This idea is not foreign to certain ancient philosophical traditions, which have long emphasized the unity of existence, but it finds unexpected resonance within modern science, where the interconnectedness of systems has become increasingly evident. Water, once again, provides a powerful metaphor. Just as individual waves arise within the continuous body of the ocean, each with its own form and duration, so individual conscious experiences may arise within a deeper unity of awareness. The waves appear separate, yet they are all expressions of the same underlying substance. Similarly, the individual molecules of water appear distinct, yet their behavior is inseparable from the network of relationships in which they participate. Thus, the study of water, in its humble way, leads us toward a vision of reality as a dynamic unity, a continuous process in which parts and wholes, observer and observed, matter and consciousness are intimately intertwined. This vision challenges the deeply ingrained habit of thinking in terms of separations. It invites us to see the world not as a collection of independent entities, but as an unfolding pattern of relationships. And within this pattern, the emergence of life and consciousness may be understood not as anomalies, but as natural expressions of an underlying coherence. If we accept this perspective, then the question of how consciousness arises from matter is transformed. Instead of asking how inert matter produces awareness, we may ask how awareness manifests itself through the forms of matter. This shift does not diminish the importance of scientific inquiry. On the contrary, it enriches it. It encourages us to explore not only the mechanisms of nature, but also the deeper patterns of unity that those mechanisms reveal. And it reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is not merely an external investigation of the world, but also an inward journey, a process through which consciousness seeks to understand its own place within the vast tapestry of existence. Thus, when we contemplate the strange and beautiful behavior of water, its capacity to sustain life, its subtle defiance of simple rules, we may begin to sense that it is pointing us toward a deeper insight. It suggests that reality is not a static assembly of parts, but a living process, a continuous interplay of relationships through which the universe expresses and experiences itself. And in this light, the ultimate mystery is no longer how matter behaves, nor even how life arises from matter, but how the unity of existence becomes aware of itself through the multiplicity of forms. For perhaps the most remarkable fact of all is not that water breaks the rules we once believed to be universal, but that, through the fragile medium of living beings, the universe has come to a point where it can reflect upon its own nature, where it can ask, in quiet astonishment, what is it that sees, through these countless eyes, the flowing river of reality? If we linger with this question, what it is that sees through these countless eyes, we begin to notice that the difficulty lies not in the complexity of the world, but in a certain habit of thought that has accompanied scientific progress for centuries. It is the habit of dividing reality into two fundamentally different domains, the objective and the subjective, the physical and the mental, the world and the observer. This division, though enormously useful in the development of science, has also created a conceptual tension that becomes increasingly apparent as our knowledge deepens. For the more precisely we describe the physical world, the more elusive the role of consciousness appears within it. Consider again the substance with which we began water. From the standpoint of physics, water can be described in exquisite detail. We can calculate the quantum energy levels of its molecules, simulate their interactions, predict the thermodynamic properties of vast ensembles. Our mathematical models can reproduce, with remarkable accuracy, the behavior of liquid water under a wide range of conditions. Yet there remains a curious gap between these descriptions and the lived experience of water. No equation captures the coolness of a stream against the skin, the shimmering patterns of sunlight upon a lake, the deep biological resonance of thirst and its satisfaction. These qualities, what philosophers call the qualitative aspects of experience, do not appear in the language of physics. This does not mean that physics is incomplete in its own domain. It means that physics, by its very nature, deals with abstractions. It describes relationships among measurable quantities, not the totality of experience itself. Thus, the scientific picture of the world is, in a sense, a map, an extraordinarily detailed and powerful map, but not the territory. The territory includes the domain of direct experience, the domain in which consciousness operates. And it is here that the deepest questions arise. What is the relationship between the abstract structures described by science and the concrete immediacy of experience? This question has often been framed in terms of the so-called mind-body problem. But the very formulation of this problem presupposes a separation that may itself be misleading. It assumes that mind and matter are fundamentally different kinds of things that must somehow be reconciled. But perhaps the difficulty arises precisely because we attempt to treat them as separate. From another perspective, we may consider both mind and matter as aspects of a single underlying reality, two complementary ways of describing the same fundamental process. In my philosophical reflections, I have often drawn upon the analogy of a single object viewed from different angles. The object itself remains one, yet its appearance changes depending upon the perspective of the observer. Similarly, what we call physical processes and what we call mental experiences may be different aspects of the same underlying unity. Water provides a subtle illustration of this unity. At the physical level, it is a network of interacting molecules. At the biological level, it is the medium of life's processes. At the experiential level, it is something we perceive, feel, and interpret, something that acquires meaning within the context of our lives. These levels are not separate realities, but different ways of engaging with the same phenomenon. The mistake arises when we attempt to reduce one level entirely to another, when we try to explain the richness of experience solely in terms of physical interactions, or conversely, when we ignore the physical basis of experience altogether. A more balanced view recognizes that both perspectives are necessary, and that each illuminates aspects of reality that the other cannot fully capture. This recognition leads us toward a more integrated understanding of nature, one that acknowledges the limits of reductionism while preserving the rigor of scientific inquiry. Reductionism has been extraordinarily successful in uncovering the fundamental constituents of matter. By breaking complex systems into simpler parts, we have gained deep insights into the mechanisms underlying physical phenomena. But reductionism encounters difficulties when applied to systems whose behavior depends critically on the interactions among their parts. Systems in which the whole exhibits properties that cannot be predicted from the properties of the parts alone. Water is one such system. Its remarkable properties, its surface tension, its heat capacity, its solvent capabilities emerge from the collective behavior of its molecules. No single molecule possesses these properties in isolation. They arise only through the dynamic interplay of many interacting components. This phenomenon, often referred to as emergence, is not limited to water. It is a general feature of complex systems, from biological organisms to ecological networks to human societies. In each case, the behavior of the whole cannot be fully understood by analyzing the parts independently. The relationships among the parts are equally fundamental. And it is precisely this relational aspect that challenges the classical conception of reality as composed of independent entities. The deeper we look, the more we find that the world is woven from relationships, from patterns of interaction that give rise to the phenomena we observe. In this sense, reality resembles a tapestry rather than a collection of separate threads. Each thread contributes to the overall pattern, but its significance cannot be understood apart from the context in which it appears. This metaphor extends naturally to the realm of life and consciousness. A living organism is not merely a collection of molecules. It is an organized process, a dynamic pattern sustained through continuous interaction with its environment. Its identity lies not in its material components, which are constantly being replaced, but in the persistence of its organizational pattern. Similarly, consciousness may be understood not as a static entity, but as an ongoing process, a flow of awareness that integrates sensory input, memory, and interpretation into a coherent experience of the world. From this perspective, the distinction between self and world becomes less rigid. The self is not an isolated object, but a dynamic node within a network of relationships. This idea resonates with certain philosophical traditions that emphasize the unity of existence. It suggests that the apparent multiplicity of individual beings may be expressions of a deeper underlying coherence. In my own reflections, I have proposed that consciousness is fundamentally singular, that the sense of separate individual minds arises from the limitations of perspective, much as the apparent separation of waves arises from the surface of the ocean. Each wave appears distinct, yet all are expressions of the same underlying water. This analogy is particularly fitting, given our subject, for water, in its fluid continuity, provides a vivid image of unity underlying diversity. Just as the molecules of water are constantly exchanging partners within an ever-shifting network, so the experiences of consciousness may be seen as transient configurations within a continuous field of awareness. This does not imply that individual experiences are illusory. On the contrary, they are real in their own domain, but their reality may be understood as relational rather than absolute, as arising from participation in a larger whole. Such a view has profound implications for how we understand life and existence. If consciousness is not an isolated phenomenon confined to individual organisms, but an aspect of a deeper unity, then the emergence of life may be seen as a process through which this unity becomes increasingly complex in its modes of self-expression. Life, in this sense, is not merely a chemical accident. It is a stage in the unfolding of a deeper order, an order that integrates matter, energy, information, and awareness into a coherent process. Water, once again, plays a central role in this unfolding. Its unique properties create the conditions under which biological organization becomes possible. It provides the medium through which molecular interactions can achieve the complexity necessary for life. In this way, water serves as a bridge connecting the physical laws that govern matter with the emergent phenomena that characterize living systems. And through living systems, it participates indirectly in the emergence of consciousness, the capacity of the universe to reflect upon itself. This perspective invites us to reconsider the nature of scientific explanation. Science excels at describing mechanisms, the causal relationships that govern physical processes. But when we encounter phenomena such as life and consciousness, we must also consider questions of meaning and purpose, questions that lie beyond the scope of purely mechanical explanation. This does not mean abandoning scientific rigor. It means recognizing that different kinds of questions require different modes of inquiry. The study of life and consciousness calls for an approach that integrates empirical observation with philosophical reflection, an approach that acknowledges both the measurable aspects of reality and the experiential dimensions that give those aspects significance. In this integrated view, the boundaries between disciplines become more permeable. Physics, biology, psychology, and philosophy converge in a shared effort to understand the nature of existence. And as we pursue this understanding, we may come to see that the ultimate mystery is not located in any particular phenomenon, not in water, not in life, not even in consciousness itself, but in the unity that underlies them all. For beneath the multiplicity of forms, beneath the countless interactions that constitute the fabric of the world, there may exist a deeper coherence, a single reality, expressing itself through an infinite variety of perspectives. If this is so, then our scientific inquiries are not merely attempts to describe an external world. They are also expressions of a deeper process, a process through which the universe, in the form of conscious beings, seeks to understand its own nature. And in this light, the peculiar behavior of water, its subtle defiance of simple rules, its intimate connection to life appears not as an isolated curiosity, but as a symbol of a much larger truth. That reality is not composed of rigid boundaries and independent parts, but of flowing relationships, dynamic patterns, and a unity that reveals itself through diversity. Thus, as we contemplate water, its fluidity, its capacity to sustain life, its quiet refusal to conform entirely to our simplified models, we may begin to sense that it is pointing us toward a deeper insight still. It suggests that the ultimate structure of reality may not be mechanical at all, but organic, not a machine assembled from parts, but a living whole in which every element participates in a shared process of becoming. And this realization leads us, inevitably, to one final and profound question. If the universe is indeed a unified process expressing itself through countless forms, then what role does consciousness, your consciousness, at this very moment, play in the unfolding of that process? If we now approach this final question with patience, not as something to be answered hastily, but as something to be inhabited, we begin to notice that it carries within it a quiet reversal of perspective. For throughout the long history of science, we have asked how consciousness arises within the universe. We have imagined a vast, ancient cosmos existing long before life appeared. And then, at some late stage, consciousness emerging as a rare and fragile byproduct of biological complexity. But if we follow the implications of our inquiry with sufficient rigor, we discover that this picture may itself be inverted. It is not that consciousness appears within the universe as an accidental addition. Rather, it is through consciousness that the universe appears at all. This statement, though it may sound radical, is not mystical in its origin. It follows directly from the most elementary fact of experience. Everything you know of the world, its stars, its oceans, its laws of physics, is known only as content within awareness. You never encounter the universe as something entirely outside experience. You encounter perceptions, interpretations, models, all of which arise within the field of consciousness. This does not imply that the universe depends upon your individual mind for its existence, but it does suggest that the concept of existence itself is inseparable from the possibility of awareness. Without awareness, the notion of a world becomes meaningless. There may be processes, interactions, events, but there would be no recognition of them as such. There would be no distinction between order and chaos, no sense of continuity, no comprehension of law. Thus, consciousness is not merely another phenomenon within the universe. It is the condition under which the universe becomes intelligible. And this realization brings us back, once more, to the humble substance that has guided our reflections, water. For water offers a subtle metaphor for this relationship between the underlying unity of reality and the diverse forms through which it appears. Imagine a vast ocean. Upon its surface arise countless waves, each with its own shape, its own duration, its own trajectory. To an observer focused upon the surface alone, these waves may appear as separate entities. They may collide, merge, dissipate. They may seem to possess independent existence. Yet in truth, each wave is nothing other than the movement of the same water. Its individuality is a temporary pattern within a continuous medium. Similarly, the multiplicity of conscious beings may be understood as patterns within a deeper unity of awareness. Each individual perspective is unique, shaped by particular biological and cultural conditions. But the capacity for awareness itself, the fundamental fact of experiencing, may be shared. In this sense, consciousness is not fragmented in its essence, but only in its expressions. This idea, though difficult to articulate within the framework of classical science, finds echoes in several domains of modern thought. In quantum physics, we encounter the notion that seemingly separate systems may exhibit non-local correlations, a form of connection that transcends spatial separation. In biology, we observe that living systems function as integrated wholes, whose parts are inseparable from their relational context. And in philosophy, we find long-standing traditions that have pointed toward the unity underlying the diversity of experience. None of these perspectives alone provides a complete explanation, but together they suggest that the boundaries we perceive between objects, between organisms, even between selves, may not be as absolute as they appear. They may be practical distinctions, arising from the limitations of perspective rather than from the fundamental structure of reality. Water, once again, illustrates this beautifully. At the molecular level, water is in constant motion. Bonds form and dissolve. Structures shift. Patterns emerge and vanish. There is no fixed boundary between one cluster of molecules and another. The liquid remains continuous, even as its internal configurations change endlessly. And yet, from a larger perspective, we perceive distinct forms, droplets, streams, waves. These forms are real in their context, but they do not exist independently of the continuous medium from which they arise. In much the same way, individual lives may be understood as dynamic patterns within a continuous field of existence. Each life possesses its own history, its own experiences, its own identity. But this individuality does not negate the deeper unity in which all life participates. This recognition has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between science and meaning. Science, in its classical form, seeks to describe the external structure of reality, the measurable relationships among physical quantities. It excels at revealing the mechanisms that govern the behavior of matter and energy. But when we encounter questions of purpose, value, and meaning, we enter a domain that cannot be fully captured by quantitative description. These aspects of existence arise within the realm of experience, within the field of consciousness itself. Thus, a complete understanding of reality requires an integration of perspectives. It requires acknowledging both the objective descriptions provided by science and the subjective dimensions revealed through direct experience. This integration does not diminish the rigor of science. On the contrary, it enriches it by placing scientific knowledge within a broader context of understanding. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge is not merely an external investigation of the world, but also an inward exploration of the conditions under which knowledge becomes possible. And this brings us, finally, to the role of human consciousness within the unfolding of the universe. Each moment of awareness, each perception, each thought, each act of understanding may be seen as an instance of the universe reflecting upon itself. Through the senses of living beings, the cosmos experiences its own forms. Through the intellect, it recognizes patterns within its own processes. In this light, the emergence of conscious life is not an accidental anomaly, but a natural extension of the universe's inherent coherence. It is the point at which the underlying unity of existence becomes capable of explicit self-recognition. Water, in sustaining life, plays a quiet but indispensable role in this process. It provides the medium through which biological complexity can arise, and through which consciousness can manifest in living systems. Thus, the strange properties of water, its subtle defiance of simple rules, its capacity to support life may be understood as part of a larger narrative, the gradual unfolding of a universe that becomes increasingly capable of knowing itself. This narrative does not imply a predetermined purpose imposed from outside. Rather, it reflects the inherent tendencies of a unified system to develop greater complexity, integration, and awareness over time. And within this unfolding, each individual consciousness occupies a unique position, a particular vantage point from which the universe perceives itself. Your awareness, at this very moment, is not merely a private phenomenon confined within the boundaries of your body. It is also a window through which the larger reality becomes present to itself. This perspective invites a quiet shift in how we understand our place within the cosmos. We are not detached observers standing apart from the world we study. We are participants within a continuous process expressions of the same underlying reality that we seek to understand. The act of inquiry itself, the curiosity that drives us to ask questions, to explore, to reflect, is part of the universe's own movement toward self-awareness. Thus, the journey that began with a simple question about water leads us to a far deeper realization. We enter the study of nature seeking to understand the behavior of matter. But if we follow the inquiry to its deepest level, we discover that the ultimate mystery lies not in matter alone, but in the unity that gives rise to both matter and mind, a unity that expresses itself through the flowing patterns of existence. And perhaps this is why water, in its quiet and persistent way, remains such a powerful symbol. It flows without resistance, adapts to every form, sustains life without drawing attention to itself. It embodies continuity within change, unity within diversity. In contemplating water, we are reminded that reality itself may possess a similar character fluid, relational, and fundamentally unified. And so we arrive at the deepest question that our inquiry can offer, not a question that can be answered once and for all, but one that invites continual reflection. If consciousness is the medium through which the universe becomes aware of itself, then what does it mean that, in this fleeting moment, the vast and ancient cosmos is looking out through your eyes quietly, curiously, and perhaps, in some subtle way, recognizing itself?